I have been poring over the Mary Shelley history, and frankly, I had no idea. I had no idea how incredibly scandalous and shocking looking into her story would be. And that was kind of fun because I just knew nothing. And what I did find out completely shook me to my core. These people are so dramatic and they have so much scandal. You cannot make this stuff up. Real Housewives has nothing on this. Reality TV can forget it. The Kardashians, nope. Like, competing with the Shelley legacy is just insane. I just couldn't even believe it. As I was researching, I swear it was like my mouth just dropped more and more open. I just could not even believe it. So I'm pretty excited to share the entire saga with you. I have gotten so into this that at times I felt really emotional about the entire thing. Because while it is dramatic and there's lots of stuff that you just can't even believe, it's also really sad that this really happened to real people, and I just feel just conflicted about it because at times it's outlandish and I want to like poke fun at it, and at other times I'm just like, wow, that is some messed up stuff. So I hope you'll come on this journey with me and probably experience a lot of the same emotions I did. My goal with this author bio series is to sort of get to know the person behind the persona, to explore who these authors really were and how that might have influenced their work, and just look into the lives and habits of people who wrote some of the world's most well-known fiction. As always, I'm trying to keep this as condensed as possible and in a list format so that you have markers to sort of get through this story, but I'm also trying to keep it at least loosely chronological, which is not always an easy mix, so I hope that it all comes together for you. And obviously, if you want to have questions about it, because there's stuff I couldn't include, I can't include everything, feel free to drop me a line below and we can discuss something further. Anyways, that's enough hyping it up. Let's get into this thing. Without further ado, let's get into the 10 shocking facts about the scandalous life of Mary Shelley. I'm assuming you know this, but if you don't, Mary Shelley is the author of Frankenstein, as well as some short stories and some other novels and biographies. Basically, she wrote a lot, but what she's most known for is Frankenstein. As it turns out, she came from a literary background, and that brings us to fact number 1. Mary Shelley came from famous, sometimes infamous, parents. As with any creative mind, it's always interesting to see where they came from, and obviously our parents influence you a lot, and frankly this is one of my favorite things to include in these author bio series. William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft were the literary parents of the girl that would eventually become Mary Shelley. However, their story as individuals and as a couple started long before their daughter was born. Godwin was a well-known political theorist and novelist, and he was most famous for this kind of controversial work at the time called An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. Basically, this just outlined his beliefs, which were definitely radical and reformist at the time, and frankly, still are today. Basically, he rejected all forms of government, and he thought that humans were rational, capable beings who were able to live without law and institutions. So we already have one really politically or socially reformed-minded person as one of Mary Shelley's guideposts in life, but we also have her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. This is a name you might recognize if you've ever done feminine studies or women's rights studies, because Wollstonecraft was a supporter of female emancipation and actually wrote a book on it herself called A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, back in the day. Her beliefs that the only superiority, the only difference between men and women was purely physical strength, and that they should be equal on every other ground, be it education, sexuality, and just general independence. I haven't read her work, but just from the quick summaries I've seen, it seems like she thought that the way women were educated and taught to sort of only belong to a man or only become a wife and a mother led women to be kind of nasty creatures because they were bored, and she thought that if they were more educated or were allowed more interests and more appetites outside of traditional social structures, then they might be more happy and lead to a better society overall. Wollstonecraft sounds really interesting to me, and I might read more about her just to give me more context into this entire drama of this family. But basically her entire mindset was just further and further confirmed by the life she had. Her mother was really compliant against her abusive father, so things didn't start out too well for her there. And also, Mary Wollstonecraft would get herself into a little bit of trouble later on with an American lover she had, a guy named Gilbert Imlay, who she was completely madly in love with, and they actually had a daughter out of wedlock together named Fanny. But this Imlay guy would ultimately disappoint her as well when he decided to leave Mary and her infant daughter Fanny alone for another woman. When William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft met for the first time, they actually did not like each other, but they met again a few years later, and people were really surprised how quickly they turned into friends and then lovers. Neither believed in the institution of marriage at the time, thinking it was just the worst, but before they knew it, Mary Wollstonecraft had found herself pregnant, and though neither of them believed in it, she convinced Godwin that it was just necessary at the time due to the constraints of society. So William Godwin agreed. He became stepfather to Mary's child from her first relationship out of wedlock, Fanny, and then awaited the birth of his new daughter, who was born on August 30th, 1797. Unfortunately though, Wollstonecraft would die just 12 days later from an infection of her uterus, which is quite common after childbirth apparently, and this is back in the day when they didn't know how infection was introduced. Mary Shelley's birth name was actually named after her mother, so her full name was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and while she would never know her mother, she did endlessly study her published works, her texts, and would spend countless hours visiting her graveside, and in my opinion, she formed sort of a pseudo-mother from all of her texts combined, and I think made a false ideal of the person her mother really was, and I think this came into play later when she used her mother's work and her father's work as excuses for bad behavior, but we'll get into that. So here we are in 1797, William Godwin is left alone to be the father to his stepdaughter and to his new daughter, Mary. Godwin was so grieved by the loss of his wife that he actually put together a sort of biography about her life, and this biography would have an incredibly detrimental effect on the entire family reputation because for the 1790s, it was a bit too honest. In this biography, he just laid everything out. He talked about his own pre-marriage liaisons with Mary Wollstonecraft. He also talked about Mary Wollstonecraft's affair with this Imlay guy who had left her for another woman and who she had a child out of wedlock with. He also talked about Mary Wollstonecraft's suicide attempt because of the affairs of Imlay, because of him cheating on her, and people just could not take the truth of this, and it completely ruined not only the Godwin family reputation moving forward, but it also completely discounted everything Mary Wollstonecraft had said about female emancipation, at least as far as society was concerned. They basically said, well, she's a whore, so everything she said about females needing freedom must be just completely null. Like, null and void, don't care, everything she said is now irrelevant. Classic, am I right? Either way, the family would never be the same, and their place in society was forever shifted. It also just happened to be in line with a lot of shifts and perspectives. Godwin would have grown up during the French Revolution and just a tumultuous time in that sense where people were trying to take down long-standing governmental, socio-political standards that were in effect that he thought were just causing too huge a disparity between the haves and the have-nots. So people were going back and forth on what they thought was appropriate or what the standard should be, and it just so happened that when that biography came out about his wife, those reformist ideals that William and Wollstonecraft were so into were already kind of being questioned more. It was a lot of back and forth to my understanding. So it was just a lot of bad things at once, and it would not be the last. When I read this about her parents, I honestly couldn't even believe it because I think in my head I had painted this like pretty ideal of what society and culture was at the turn of the century at the time, and apparently I was wrong because this entire story, it's like everybody's sleeping with everybody, everybody's having sex outside of marriage, everyone's crazy. I don't know. Everyone's depressed, there's some deaths that happen later, suicides, it's just insanity, okay? And it shocked me, and this was the beginning of that. So I wanted to set that tone for you, understand where Mary Shelley came from, and bring you to fact number 2, which is that Mary Shelley had a wicked stepmother, or did she? This is exact evidence of what I just said about people being crazy and way more like freewheeling than I thought anyone was back in the day. So it's 1801 and William Godwin has married his next door neighbor. Why? Because he knocked her up. I know. Even better though was that this woman had been calling herself a widow, but in fact she was never married to either of the two separate fathers that she had had children from before. So going into this marriage with William Godwin, because he had gotten her pregnant unexpectedly, hello to life before birth control. She had two kids. One was named Charles, one was named Jane. Jane was about the same age as Mary Shelley. So William Godwin and this woman, Mary Jane Clairmont, they get married, and Mary Shelley is not happy about it. Mary Shelley had for her father what she herself described, and this is a quote, as an excessive and romantic attachment. Namely, she did not want to share his affections with even one more person, let alone 3 and soon to be 4 with a new baby brother. I just don't think she wanted to compete. And unfortunately, I wish that Mary Shelley hadn't seen the world that way, but I think she really did. I try to imagine it from her point of view, and it's actually kind of sad to me, because here's this young girl whose mother is dead, but who she sort of worships and idolizes, and a father who she also is just supremely, supremely attached to, thinks the world of him. And to her little 3-person family with Fanny, who we frankly don't know much about, and her father, that's enough for her. So this woman comes into their lives with 2 other kids, another on the way, and she must have just felt really displaced and alone. And I think this is just an addition to Mary Shelley feeling like the black sheep, which is a feeling I think she had her entire life. So young Mary just refused to accept these people. She was rude and callous. She was often the cause of a lot of strife and tension and just discourse in the household. She was even sent away through the guise of like needing health, better airs for her health or something. They thought that things traveled through the air, I don't know, back in the day. And she was sent away under that guise, but it's no doubt that her father sent her away to family friends to sort of lighten the mood and the tone in the household. And I can only imagine that while she might have had a good time on those trips, she just would have felt more displaced than before. I think at times Mary probably felt like her father was the only one on her side. It was clear from an early age that she was keenly intelligent, very aware of her surroundings, very quick-witted. And her father really encouraged that in her. He wanted her to be really educated, and he definitely supported any learning and life experiences that he thought were appropriate for her to have, which at the time would have been more so than the typical young female. It's interesting that Mary was so attached to her father when even later this stepmother would claim that Godwin loved his daughter Mary way more than he loved her. And I also feel bad for this stepmother, because she would have felt kind of miffed and not included in the family. Like, that must not be a good feeling either, to not be accepted from, you know, your new stepdaughter. And it's not really something she had much control over. And she had to live in a house with like a giant portrait of Mary Wollstonecraft, Godwin's first wife, in the hallway, and people were just like constantly comparing the two. So the tension, I'm imagining, was just like simmering and uncomfortable. That's not to say that William Godwin and Mary Jane Clairmont's marriage wasn't a good one, because I think between the two of them they were happy. It's just that everything external to them, and even some of Godwin's friends, just like didn't like his new wife as much as his previous wife. And can you just imagine how uncomfortable that would be for everybody involved? I can. Later in life, Mary Shelley would really exaggerate how her stepmother was and how she treated her, but we know that most of that was definitely, as I said, exaggerated. She wanted to paint this sort of picture about her stepmother and how she was the worst, kind of like basically the Cinderella story. And even later, when some more drama would come up, she would always sort of like, if she had a problem with her father, she would be like, well, it's my stepmother's fault. She must be goading him, when really it was obvious that the problem was between Mary Godwin and her father. I also think it says a lot about Mary Shelley's young teenage personality and how that set the scene for her more radical views and her more radical actions to come. We're getting there. Get ready for the next fact, people, because it's nuts. Fact number 3, Mary Shelley ran away from home at age 16 with a married man. Yep, let's get into it. As you know, William Godwin was published. He would have been well known as like a political reformist, someone who was interested in social change. And naturally, people would come in and out of their household, the Godwin household. They had like a publishing house thing below and they lived upstairs. And it was just sort of like a revolving door of poets and writers and philosophers and just a bunch of different minds coming together, usually minds that agreed with Godwin's views, reformist views on how society should be or should become. He thought that this was a great opportunity for his girls to experience all these different minds and perspectives, and he would encourage them to be present during meetings and readings and all sorts of things. So they got exposed to a lot of just interesting thought at an early age. Some of the people that would come through the door there would be sort of disciples of Godwin's work. Remember, he had published books out, and some people really respected what he had to say. One of those sort of disciples was Percy Bysshe Shelley, and here is where the Shelley name comes into play. Percy Shelley was a younger guy, and he was the son of a very rich, wealthy landowner, but he was kind of going against whatever his father said, and I just imagine this as like a little miffed rich kid who wants to play the pauper for a little while, or sort of like be on the other side of things and like force it in a weird way. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm like not super a fan of Percy right now, or ever. But I'm sure some people are. He's actually a really well-known poet, so if you know good things about him, share them below. But me, right now, not a fan. And you'll find out why. All right. I just view him at this point as just like a young guy who wants to be rebellious. He's just sort of going against what his father said. So basically he was a radical, he was a reformist, and he was an atheist, a fact which got him kicked out of Oxford University in 1811. Though he idolized William Godwin's doctrines, he did disagree on how they should bring them about. Godwin's all about like slow, peaceful, transformative change. But this young Percy guy didn't have any problems with inciting violence to sort of accomplish his ends. To me, that says a lot about who Percy Shelley was and how that contrasted with the values Godwin might have had. I want to mention a bit about money because I think it's important to understanding the relationship dynamic and some of the tension that occurs later in life between Percy Shelley and William Godwin. William Godwin was not doing well financially. As you know, the family had sort of fallen out of social favor. People didn't think very well of them anymore. And as a result, his publishing house was not doing very well. He was of the belief that people with excess should give him, who he viewed himself as like a just doer of social goodness, whether or not that was true, or whether or not you agree, that was his view on what he was doing. And he believed that those with money should give it to people like him working for the better good. He felt like entitled to that money, and he would make connections with people like Percy who had money, or had money and liked to pretend that he didn't want it or like it, but he needed it later. He liked to make friends with those people and get paid by them, basically. Like he needed to be supported by other people because he couldn't do it himself. So it's not like they had this pure friendship or like a pure literary meeting of the minds. I have to wonder what the dynamic there exactly was. I'm not saying they didn't like each other, I'm sure they did. But William Godwin saw Percy Shelley, I think, first and foremost as a way to get funding, and everything else kind of came later, or secondary. Godwin treated Percy Shelley like anyone else that sort of came through his doors. He encouraged his children to interact with them, and that's exactly what happened. And it did not end as innocently as Godwin would have hoped. At this time, Percy Shelley is 21, Mary, now still Godwin, is 16. So Mary and Percy started to go on these walks together, and they would be accompanied, unchaperoned, but they would be accompanied by Mary's stepsister, who was very close in age, Jane. I just want to clarify this. Jane changes her name later, but I'm going to keep it as Jane because people's names in this are very confusing, and a lot of them are the same or similar. So clarifying right now, Mary's stepsister, I'm going to call her Jane. Okay? That's just going to keep it simplest. It was on these walks that this sort of trio first got to know each other, and in particular, Mary and Percy got to know each other. They would often frequent the graveyard where her mother was buried. They would have these long talks, and not just talks about philosophy, they would have talks about themselves, and they sort of fell in love. Or I don't even really want to call it love, but I guess that's what it was. Can you tell I'm a cynic when it comes to teenage relationships? I'm just imagining them being like moody teenagers going to Mary Wollstonecraft's grave, lounging around, and it's extremely likely that in the same area where Mary Wollstonecraft was buried, this is where they hung out. This is probably the first place where they had a sexual relationship for the first time, and the whole thing makes me feel a little uncomfortable. I'm not gonna lie to you. Also, poor Jane. Jane's just sort of standing off to the side at a respectful distance, and I just can't imagine how kind of weird that must have been, but hey, that's just me. You might think that Percy would have lied about the fact that he was married, but he did not. There were no secrets between these two, and I will say, good for them, all right, I guess. So it's not like Mary was lied to or swindled into this, or I don't know, you could argue either way. She was definitely young, but it's not like he hid the fact that he had a wife back home. And not only did he have a wife, but he also had a child, and P.S., his wife was also pregnant. So he's just a stand-up guy, as far as I'm concerned. Percy's wife was named Harriet, and they had eloped when she was 16, a couple of years back, and Percy claimed that the marriage had disintegrated. He claimed that Harriet cheated on him. Biographers do not think that that is true, but nonetheless, Percy might have believed it himself, and that was the story he crafted and the story he told not only himself, but Mary. To me, it sounds like it was a pretty similar situation to what happened with Harriet. It sounds like he fell in like fast, intense love with Harriet, and then, you know, that harsh wind of reality came through and just knocked that flame of love right on out. And apparently he did not learn his lesson the first time, because he was just so taken with Mary, who he described as just so fiercely intelligent. He loved her passion, her intensity, and what he described as just like an inherent wild nature, and he just could not get enough of it. And I imagine Mary as like this 16-year-old chip on her shoulder, hates her stepmom, probably just feels really alone in the world, and this guy is paying her attention. It probably feels great. She probably feels like they connect on a lot of levels, and they did. Like, I'm not trying to deny that they didn't love each other, because obviously they loved each other. I'm just saying maybe it would have been better to start in a different way, but I'm just saying. I'm totally judging them. It's hard not to. Meanwhile, William Godwin, Mary's father, is totally oblivious, and he just thinks they're going on these nice intellectual walks, when suddenly Percy comes in and he is like, I declare my love for your daughter and I shall take her abroad with me. And William Godwin is like, what is happening? He's shocked. He can't believe it. William Godwin, what are you doing? You have too much faith in people, my man. Too much faith. If it was the early 1800s and your 16-year-old daughter was running away with a 21-year-old married man with a wife and a child on the way. I don't know, I'm freaking out. I'm freaking out a little bit. I am feeling William Godwin's 100-year-old freak out, and it is in me right now, and I just can't handle this. So naturally he pulled a Romeo and a Juliet, and he tried to keep them apart, and it did not work, because Jane, Mary's stepsister and friend to both of these two, was sort of acting as like an intermediary. She was like sending notes and poems between these two lovers, and eventually Mary and Jane put on these black silk gowns and they slipped out of the house and they met Percy in a coach and they ran away together. Stupid, if you ask me. Some people might call it romantic. I call it dumb. You're probably wondering what the heck was in this for Jane, the stepsister. Well, I imagine Jane probably felt just as much of a reformist and sort of like a young radical. She was probably just as emotionally involved in their ideals as the other two. And it's very clear that Jane also had a crush or had some sort of like feelings for this Percy guy. So I don't know what kind of cologne he was wearing, but it must have been good stuff. So this new trio together, they travel to France, and they're like, this place is gross because, hello, France at the time was like kind of a hot mess. And then they went to Switzerland, which they felt better about. Then they ran out of money and had to go back to England. And get this, this is where I'm like, Percy, it is hard for me to like you because of stuff like this, man. I just can't even take it. So they're completely out of money and they get back to England, and this is where Harriet, his actual wife, lives with their child and a child in her belly by him, ready to go. He goes back to her with his new mistress and her stepsister, who, I don't know, maybe they were together, who can say? He goes up to her and is like, hey, can I have 20 pounds? And she's like, no. And he's like, hey, can I have 20 pounds though? And she's like, no, dude, back the heck off. Eventually though, she does give him the 20 pounds, but she did decidedly say absolutely no thank you to his very simple request for her to simply just join the group. Just, come on, join us all. Won't we all have wonderful, free, happy, awkward sexual times together. And Harriet was just not into this idea, so she said no. And yeah, it was awkward. Can we take a reality check for a second? Like, what is even happening with these people? What is even happening? Can you just like imagine my face as I'm reading through this biography? It was just like, I couldn't even believe it. I can't handle it. I still can't handle it. Fact number 4, and this is sort of a quick one because it's important later, Mary Godwin was estranged from her father, William Godwin. So this trio comes back to England after running away, right? And they just like walk up to William Godwin's house like expecting to be welcomed with open arms, I guess? I don't know. Seems crazy to me. And William Godwin is just like absolutely not. He's not into it. He doesn't accept them. He completely ignores them. And even when he sees them in the street, he just is like, no, don't see you. I don't know you're there. Just completely ignores them, like is completely cut off and just shocked. Maybe you think that that's harsh, and I see your point, because it kind of is. But I also think about William Godwin and the family at large, okay? Because Mary running away and Jane running away, it's not just about his concern for the two of them. It's also a concern for the entire family and the success and the integrity of that family from a financial standpoint. Like, remember, these people are already sort of like not looking good to the rest of society. It's already questionable. So they're sort of hanging on by a tether. And then there's the aspect that there are other girls in this family. There are other girls like Fanny and still Jane, because technically Jane isn't with Percy, like, you know, on paper or whatever, that would have a chance to get married and have a life and be comfortable. And don't parents want their children to be comfortable after they're gone? I think that's really what William was worried about. So try not to be like too hard on him. Like, these are weird times back in the day. There's a lot of social expectation and social rules. And I think he was just trying to do his best to look out for everybody as well as he could. And I imagine he was very hurt. Like, it kind of sounds like Mary was his favorite kid. And like, what a disappointment and what a letdown that must have felt like at the time. He probably had much higher hopes for her, like as such an intelligent person. I don't know. It's sad though. Mary's argument, like back to her father, was, hey, I'm just doing what you would have done, because remembered she really studied his texts and her mother's texts throughout her life. She would just like reread their books. So I think Mary, in her like warped teenage, conflicted, black sheep, chip on her shoulder mind, was just using her parents' texts and sort of like warping them in a way to fit her own narrative of like what she wanted to do or what she thought was best. I think she sort of idolized them in an unhealthy way and then just used it as an excuse. Obviously, her father saw a really big difference between a 16-year-old running away with a married man and what he had done with Mary Wollstonecraft, which was like they were both adults and neither of them were married and neither of them had any entanglements. So to him, it was like, hey, that's kind of a big difference. And Mary was like, nah, Dad, nah. But let's get back to the weird romance stuff with fact number 5. Mary Shelley was in a love triangle, kind of, maybe, also maybe more than one, who can say? So let me explain the situation going on with Percy and his harem of women at this point. So Percy is like estranged from his really rich father. His father is like, man, what a screw up you're being, and I don't want anything to do with you. And his dad sort of like cut the purse strings. Not so good for Percy, who now had to take care of course, financially, his wife, Harriet, their child together, and a child she was about to have. But he also had to take care of Mary and her stepsister Jane, who he cared for very, very much. It's a little awkward. Whatever's going on there does not seem kosher. So Percy suddenly has a lot of debt piling up. He's got a lot of people to take care of. And so they had to live separately for a time. Like, Percy lived with Harriet because she was literally about to pop. She had her son Charles. So Harriet from Percy would have a daughter. I can't say her name. It's I-A-N-T-H-E. I don't know how to say that. Ianth? I really don't know. And a son, Charles. And by the way, did I mention that Mary was clearly pregnant now? So yeah, a lot of pressure on old Percy. But I have to say, he kind of brought it on himself. So tensions are already high. Everybody's living separately. Mary has to live with her stepsister Jane, and their relationship is kind of weird, as I imagine it would be if you were like sexually competitive with your stepsister, with someone you were in love with and were having their child who also had a wife and kids. So it was just a bad rough situation. There's no like definitive proof that Jane and Percy were sexually, physically intimate, but regardless whether or not the act was committed, which frankly I kind of am inclined to believe it did at least once over the years, regardless of that, there was an emotional intimacy that was being competed against. And Mary started to really dislike Jane for just constantly getting in the way of the limited time she already had with Percy. And I think, once again, Mary was feeling displaced. Like, where's her place? Who is on Mary's side? Because a lot of the times, it seems like no one. Just to give you evidence of why I think more was going on here than what was recorded in journals was because of their philosophies, or at least definitely Percy's philosophies. One of their favorite books at the time was actually The Empire of the Nares, which was like an imagined community, like a fictional book, right? In which men and women had equal rights, but everyone was also naked, and it was like free sex everywhere, everyone, all the time. This was like hippies before the hippies were hippies, you know? Seems like Mary found this sort of stuff like probably fun and racy to read, but it was much less practical in reality for her than what Percy thought. He once suggested she bathe naked in a French stream. By the way, may I remind you, it is 1814. Mary declined that offer, which I feel is wise, but it also got weirder than that, and this sort of belief or philosophy that they had as younger people, that like free sex and like no relationships was like a good idea, it got weird. At this point, it's 1814, and Mary is pregnant with Percy's child, and Percy just so happens to have this friend named Thomas Jefferson Hogg. Not Thomas Jefferson, okay? Different guy. Thomas Jefferson Hogg. This Hogg guy was really, like, he thought Mary was beautiful. Lots of people did, by the way. And he was interested in her sexually. Percy full on like encouraged this. He was like, yeah, man, go for it. And he would encourage Mary to say yes to this. And I kind of imagine Mary as just sort of like trying to look cool, like trying to fit in with the cool kids in a way. And at least that's my belief, because she kind of kept putting Hogg off and putting him off. And it seems like she flirted with the idea just enough to look interesting or to seem cool. Again, this is like me totally inferring. But she ultimately said no. First, she told this guy, who is, by the way, all things considered, like a pretty nice guy. She found him like really comfortable, but she just was not physically attracted to him. And I think she found the whole thing weird. Like, she was so in love and so dedicated to Percy. At first, she told this Hogg guy that she was pregnant and that he would have to wait until she delivered her baby, but she never like came through on that promise. And this poor Hogg guy, he was just dragged along and he never got what he wanted. But he'll come back in the story later, don't you worry. Later in life, Hogg actually comes back in the scene and is sort of like a common law husband to a later friend of theirs named Jane Williams, but we'll get there. All of these things together just make me think I wouldn't be surprised if the love triangle between Percy, Mary, and Jane was entirely intimate. Like, I really genuinely would not be surprised. Again, there's no, that I know of, physical evidence of Jane and Percy physically consummating their very emotional, tight connection. But I wouldn't be surprised. Things were tense, and Mary really wanted Jane to just get the heck out of there. She was just over it, and she would sort of like beg Percy at times, like, can we please get a break from her? Like, I can't take it. And I don't want you to think that Percy wasn't completely obsessed with Mary, because I really think he was. I just think he had a very intense wandering eye, and that he didn't think there was anything wrong with that. Jane actually left the group for a short period of time, and she would get herself into a world of trouble. But this was good for Mary because she wanted to use that time to like reconnect with Percy and make them more of like a two-person unit and not people who had like, you know, everyone in on the action. You know what I'm saying? It just so happened that actually the day Jane left, they got a financial break as well, and Percy's father agreed to pay off of his debts and give him like a yearly stipend. So things were looking good financially, and for Mary, they probably looked a lot better because she had Percy to herself for a little while at least. This also meant that Percy could like afford to have his wife Harriet and their two children, Ianthe and Charles, sort of taken care of. So he didn't have to worry about them anymore. Not that I think he was particularly worried about them to begin with, but hey, So basically he was now free to just do whatever he wanted, live the artist life, travel around with Mary and later Jane. And I think this is kind of ironic and kind of funny because this rich kid who was claiming to live this life of reform and evening things out and fairness was still like pulling from daddy's coffers, you know? I mean, it's kind of annoying to me. Like, he can talk the talk, but he can't walk the walk, apparently. Can you tell that I'm not a fan of Percy? Is that coming across? Like, I feel like it is, maybe stronger than it should. All right, so fact number 6 is that Mary Shelley's stepsister Jane had a love child with Lord Byron. Here we go, let's get into the drama. Okay, so I actually think that this is really sad. Like, I know I'm talking about this in sort of a weird, like, up and down tone because so much of it to me is honestly mind-blowing, like I can't even believe it. But on the other hand of it being scandalous and like fun to gossip and gasp about, it's also kind of a bummer. Like, these are real people, you know? Like, it was 100 years ago, dude, but they were real, and it kind of breaks my heart at times, just like the decisions they made, and I have to be like, why? Why would you do that? I don't understand. So, you already know that Jane and Mary as stepsisters were kind of competitive with each other, at least over Percy, but they were also competitive over literary success. I imagine coming from a family like the Godwin family, there was some pressure to be or have some sort of literary achievement in your life. So they were competitive over that as well, over their career success. So while Jane is on her own, she decides to write letters to like the most popular poet of the time, Lord Byron. So over a series of letters, she convinced him to meet, and she had like asked him for career advice and had sent a manuscript for him to look at. And when she met him in person, she propositioned him with sex. Jane, you're letting me down. Maybe it was due to his charm, maybe it was for career advancement, maybe a little bit of both, I don't know. At first, Byron said no, but then, and this is a quote, a very disappointing one, if I may add, this is a quote, he initially like declined this offer of sex, but then he later said to a friend, quote, "If a girl of 18 comes prancing to you at all hours, there is but one way," end quote. It's a classy dude. So they sleep together, and Jane must be very fertile because she finds herself, yep, pregnant. I think Jane was quite pleased with herself. Like, she thought that she had like got a catch, and either she didn't know that Lord Byron was so promiscuous, or she just didn't care, or she thought that she could be the one to change him. Either way though, it happened. She wanted his attention, she fought for it a lot, and I think she had trouble like having a consistent sexual relationship with him, though it did happen a few more times. And I think she felt kind of proud that it was her famous friend that she got to introduce to Mary and Percy instead of the other way around. And the 4 of these people would actually become pretty good friends, and they traveled to Switzerland together. They had some good times in Switzerland and met a lot of people, had a lot of great literary conversations that inspired, yes, Frankenstein. And at the end of the summer, they moved back to England. And this was mostly to avoid more scandal for both the Godwins and for Lord Byron, who I'm sure with all those women coming in and out, it already didn't look so good for him socially. People would apparently like point telescopes at his windows where he was staying, like wanting to catch a glimpse of something. Like, people are nuts. So Jane, in her pregnant condition, they want to take her back to England and sort of keep it on the down low. And they decide not to move back to London because guess what? She does not want to tell her stepfather or her mother that she is indeed pregnant. In Bath, she started calling herself Mrs. Claremont, and she delivered a baby girl named Allegra in January of 1817. This is where it actually gets really sad for me, and I'm like once again on an emotional roller coaster with these people, because I think what happens to Jane next is just like really unfair and messed up. So she agreed to send her daughter, her baby, Allegra, to live with Lord Byron, and she sent her child to Italy with a nurse to accomplish that. But she quickly regretted it. I'm not sure what the dynamic was exactly back in the day, but Lord Byron obviously would have been to care for the child, at least in theory, better than Jane and Mary and Percy would have, as sort of a strange, controversial group of people who didn't necessarily have the best means or know-how. So she had sent her daughter away to live with Lord Byron, but she just regretted it. She missed her instantly, and she just really, really, really wanted to see her. But for whatever reason, she couldn't just go to Lord Byron and say, "I want to see my kid," because that wouldn't have flown. So Percy had to travel to meet up with Byron and sort of like be friendly and convince him in an organic way to allow Jane to see her child. He did let her see Allegra, But then he did take her back because he did not want his child to be raised in a godless household and by people of the moral standing of the Shelleys, which I think is kind of funny coming from Byron. I think basically he liked the Shelleys, he enjoyed them, he thought they were interesting, but I don't think he necessarily had the most faith in their parenting skills. I don't know. Which is also ironic and kind of rude, because what ended up happening, and this is the really sad part, is that Jane did not get to see Allegra. Byron sent Allegra, this little girl, to a convent where she actually contracted typhus and then passed away at a very young age. Jane was obviously incredibly distraught over this, and she hated Byron from then on out. For a long time, she had idolized him and thought maybe they'd get back together. And after this, she just could not forgive it and would not ever agree with Mary whenever Mary would praise them, because they were still friends with them. It's pretty messed up, you know? And I just feel so horrible for Jane. Like, nobody deserves that. And I'm not saying that Byron killed his kid. People can't control if they get typhus or not, but I'm just saying it's really unfortunate that that circumstance was her reality, and that she never got to be with her kid, and that her child died at just 5 years old, far away from her mother, and that her mother never really got that much time with her, especially after Byron saying all those things about how they wouldn't have been fit to like keep her healthy and live. Unfortunately, that would not be the first child to pass away within the Shelley group, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to take a break from the drama for a minute because it's a lot. Isn't it crazy like how all over the place these people were? Like, to me, it's mind-boggling. Truly, I wonder if it is for you. If it is, if you're freaking out, if you freaked out at all, let me know, because I knew nothing about Mary Shelley going into this, and it's just continued to blow my mind. I do want to say though, for all of Mary Shelley's like young dalliances and her interesting radical philosophies, she was a very dedicated writer. She was really interested in her career. She was self-educated, and she was expressly dedicated to being successful in the literary field in some way, shape, or form, and I have to respect her for that. She also had a really interesting dynamic with Percy, where she and Percy would share a journal together. So they would read each other's little drafts and poems and notes and letters and travel entries. They shared that all together, and they would discuss things extensively. I think she found in Percy like her minds match as far as intellectual things go. And she really was able to bounce ideas off of him and him off of her. It was definitely very collaborative. There's also some really heavy influence of Byron in Mary's work, and later in life she would copy draft for him and help him work on his own poetry and things. So let's take a minute to talk about her literary success, or I guess kind of lack thereof, because she was never financially successful enough to be on her own from her writing. But that's not to say that her work went unnoticed or that she was just slacking off, because that wasn't true. The idea for Frankenstein is not so cut and dry, and I think a lot of the inspiration came from her travels as a teenager and with Percy, and then the idea all came together when they were in Switzerland with Jane and Lord Byron. Lord Byron and Percy and Mary were all super close, and Jane was sort of like a silent participant, but they were all really heavily influenced by each other. They would read to one another, and the night that Mary had the idea for Frankenstein, or the first like real culmination of it, they were reading from a book of German ghost stories, and the pieces for Frankenstein just sort of fell into place over time. 3 publishers would reject Frankenstein before it was published for the first time in 1818, and it was actually published anonymously, but the dedication to William Godwin, her father, at least made people know that the author had a certain political leaning, and that is why the book was initially disliked by the conservative audience and conservative readers. They saw William Godwin's name in there and knew his reputation, and they thought, well, whoever wrote this, you know, it's clear that they're pushing these political agendas, and it's true. I mean, there's aspects of that in that story for sure. But I do wonder what they would have thought of it if William Godwin's name wasn't in there. Sir Walter Scott actually read it and liked it. He called it like a nice juvenile attempt and that he wanted to see more, and he actually wrote a letter. He assumed that it was Percy Shelley's work, and it was not. And Mary actually wrote him back correcting him, and I just like that little tidbit. I thought it was sweet and funny. In the 1820s, Frankenstein was actually turned into a play, and that play had numerous spin-offs. It was really successful, and various versions of it continued well into the 1850s. It was during the plays that this switch from Frankenstein being referred to as the monster rather than the scientist happened for the first time. That's the Hollywood version. If you haven't read the book, then you should know that Frankenstein is the doctor and the monster is the monster. But somewhere along the line in the dramatization, that got flipped around and it's stuck. Even when I talk about it, I still sometimes call the monster in the book Frankenstein, even though I know it's incorrect. I can't help it. She would go on to just continue writing whenever hardships came in their life, and trust me, they're coming. More so than before, I know. Writing was what she always turned to get her through the hard times. She worked not just on her own stuff and short stories and travel books and all sorts of the like. She also worked for Lord Byron, she worked for other people, she worked on biographies, and later in life she would work really dedicatedly to crafting a biography for her late husband, Percy Shelley. I wanted to take a break, talk a little bit about her literary career, and now we will jump back into it, which is fact number 8. Mary Godwin and Percy Shelley's relationship and later marriage would further ostracize them from society. It's the fall of 1816 and 2 suicides in the families are going to radically change their lives forever. In October, Mary's half-sister Fanny, who was her mother's first daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft's first child, Fanny, killed herself by an overdose of laudanum. I don't know why. The entire family, Mary Wollstonecraft included, had depressive tendencies. Maybe it was just that. Maybe it was that she felt conflicted loyalties between her father and the runaway sisters who she loved. It could have been a lot of things. In December, just a few months later, Percy's wife, Harriet, killed herself by drowning. She was actually pregnant at the time. And I know this is really hard to hear, and it's actually hard to talk about, because I think obviously suicide is a hard thing to talk about, and it makes people really emotional. It makes me emotional. These are real people, you know, and this is like going back to it's so outlandish, all these things that have happened and the decisions they made, but at the end of the day, this really happened. People really felt these things, and they really decided to take their lives because of it. This is an instance with Harriet that really made me dislike Percy more, and frankly made society dislike Mary and Percy together even more. Mary felt bad, I'm sure, for Harriet's death. I mean, she knew this woman. But she also took it as an opportunity, and so did Percy, for the two of them to finally be married. And even worse, they didn't even wait that long. Harriet died in the beginning of December, and Mary and Percy were married at the end of December. So it just all seemed very in poor taste. And people already ostracized the Shelley group because they were not living to social rules. But this just took it over the top. Like, people just thought, hey man, that's kind of messed up. And frankly, it was. I actually found Harriet's suicide letter on the internet, which frankly, one, feels very weird to say, and 2, yes, it was very strange to read. I'm not going to quote from it because it seems like too much, but I will link to it if you want to see it. I think Percy wanted to lie to himself about why Harriet killed herself, and he claimed it was because of a man she had started seeing, a man whose child she was actually pregnant with at the time. But frankly, I disagree. I think Percy said that to himself and to Mary and to Jane and to whoever because he wanted things to be convenient for his own means, like most people do. And that's kind of why I was curious about her letter, because I wanted to know if Percy was true or something else was going on. And I will just say that Harriet does not mention this guy she had gotten pregnant by at all. Who she does mention for more than half of the letter is Percy, who she calls Bish, which is his middle name. And she basically asked him, like her dying wish, do not take the children. Let my sister raise them. She's better than I ever was, which is honestly a really sad thing to say. But that's how she felt, I guess. And basically just said, you know, I forgive you. She said some really sad stuff. It's even hard for me to like repeat. She said basically, if you hadn't have left me, I would probably still be alive, but you did, and I forgive you, and I wish you every happiness. What annoys me about Percy is not just the fact that they took this opportunist moment to get married so soon after her death, but also that he refused to honor that wish of hers. And he wanted to gain custody of these kids who, I mean, it's not like, what was he gonna offer them, really? And you might disagree with me on that, and that's okay. But I feel like if her dying wish was let them be raised by someone stable in a stable place in a stable household who already loves them and they already know well, why not do that, man? Why not do that? That was actually part of why Percy married Mary, is because he knew that he had a better chance of getting custody of the kids if he could have an appropriate stepmother and that they could seem like a nuclear family. But that did not work. The Lord Chancellor actually deemed his social life and his philosophies as unfit for raising children, and Charles and Ianthe, his 2 children by Harriet, were actually raised by foster parents. Mary had her own reasons for wanting to do this wedding as well, not only because I'm sure she loved Percy, obviously, and wanted to be with him in an official capacity, even though she pretended she was against that, but also because she knew it would make her father happy, and she wanted that estrangement to be over. She wanted them to talk and to be a family again, and she knew that he would approve of the marriage, and that would make them legitimate in his eyes, so it was also convenient for Mary. Up until this point, the only contact William Godwin had with Mary and Percy was through finances, because yes, he still wanted the money that Percy had promised him all those years ago for supporting the work he believed he was trying to do to make the world a better place. So this dynamic of money and finance between everyone in the family, I think, just added another layer of tension, another dynamic to their relationship. And by the way, William Godwin still had no idea that Jane had given birth to Lord Byron's baby. So there's lots of secret keeping going on in this family. So while the marriage did make Mary and Percy Shelley legitimate, and it did give Mary her name we know her by, Mary Shelley, it never completely made them legitimate in society's eyes, and for some people it turned them even more away from them and their friendships and their company because of them getting married just so soon after Harriet's death, and just stuff they were already known for, the sexual stuff, their philosophy, the fact that Percy was such like an adamant atheist, which was just not okay at the time. These were all things that just really ostracized them and kept them away from really forming friendships. And it would continue their entire life, though later on Mary would try to redeem herself even more. She could never quite escape her reputation. Fact number 9, and this is another really sad one to me, Mary Shelley actually had 5 pregnancies before she was 25, but only 1 of her children would survive to adulthood. This is hard. That's hard for anybody, and the circumstances surrounding it are actually really sad. And for me to figure out when these pregnancies occurred, when her children were born and passed away, was a little difficult. And I actually just decided to just outline them by year. So that's exactly what I've done, and we're just gonna go through them one at a time. For me, these are the more humanizing things of Mary. Like, these people were young, you know? They did not have the most, or Mary at least didn't have the most stable upbringing. She started out life with a chip on her shoulder, and she never let it go. But things like this, like hardships, are hardships. They're hard for everybody. I don't really care like what your decision was. Some things are out of people's control, and I feel like these are some of those. And it just gives me more of the conflicting feelings I feel about this entire life story. So the first pregnancy that Mary had was in February of 1814. It was a girl, and she was born prematurely, and she actually died 2 weeks later. In August of 1815, Mary was pregnant again with a boy that they would name William Godwin after her father, as a way to try to mend the ties between them. Then she had a daughter named Clara in September of 1817, who would die a year later in 1818 in Italy. This is actually a really sad time for Mary, and like a really formative time. She lost 2 of her children in less than a year, and it must have been just absolutely indescribable. The deaths of William and Clara occurred when they were traveling in Italy. Clara had dysentery. Mary and Percy, I guess, just didn't realize how bad it was, and by the time it was clear that something was very, very wrong, they rushed to Venice to get a doctor, and unfortunately it was not quick enough. Clara actually passed away in Mary's arms. That same year, William contracted worms, which was a fairly minor problem at the time, and they had made plans to move somewhere colder to help with his healing, which is just the belief at the time, but they delayed doing that too long. And from the marshes in Rome, William actually caught malaria and died just 5 days later. Mary was just completely overcome with depression. Her father was afraid that she would take after her mother and her half-sister Fanny, and was afraid that she would attempt suicide. He wrote her letters begging her to just continue on. And the way she did that was through writing. Once again, she turned to that as something to catapult her through things. And she did. It was during this time she wrote a really controversial work called Matilda that you can Google if you want. But the point is that she just kept steadfast until her next pregnancy. She gave birth to Percy Florence Shelley in 1819, and he was the only child which would live to adulthood. In 1822, she was pregnant once again, but she miscarried and actually almost died, and they were far away from the doctors and there was no one to help them. And Percy actually put her in a bath of ice, and that was basically how they saved her. As you can expect, the relationship between Mary and Percy after the deaths of their children and after miscarriages was not as lively and innocent as it might have been. The relationship was definitely strained, and Percy, with his wandering eye, would give affections to a family friend, Jane Williams, and some other women that they would just meet or be friendly with. I'm not saying he was physically intimate with them, but the point of the matter is he used them to like fuel his creativity and to have someone to talk to. Apparently Mary became really just despondent. Don't blame her. And it was just a rough time for their relationship. Sadly though, and I even hate to say it, times are about to get even harder for Mary, because in 1822, the same year as her miscarriage, Percy Shelley, her now husband, passed away by a complete freak accident. He was on a little boat coming home from seeing a friend, and just a freak storm came and the boat went over and he passed away. Mary actually didn't even know that something was wrong until 4 days later, and she didn't even know for sure that he had passed away until his body and the bodies of his companions had washed up along shore. And she just felt so conflicted. Like, it's just crazy that one person can go through so much at one time in life. I mean, she lost 2 of her children in the same year. Then like she had a little bit of brightness when Percy Florence was born. Then she miscarried again. And then not soon after, her husband died. I mean, it's just crazy. Can you just imagine the emotions that a person has to go through? And for me, this ties in even more so with just the cruel fate of Mary Shelley's life, which in my opinion is this constant feeling of being displaced. And I think that really comes across in her fiction. She often writes, like in Frankenstein and The Lost Man and some of her short stories, she writes about people that are cut off from the world or neglected or looked down upon by society. I think she was those people, and I think that's how she expressed it and how she dealt with her grief and just her feelings toward life in general. And this brings us to fact number 10. Mary Shelley struggled to build any meaningful, lasting relationships in her life. If we take a look at how Mary Shelley's life moved forward after Percy Shelley's death, we get a kind of lonely, despondent picture. Because Mary and Percy's relationship had been so rocky and kind of cold and distant at the time of his death, I think she felt even worse about her treatment of him in the past few years, and guilty about her depression, and just felt bad about the way things had turned out for them. And who wouldn't? It's a pretty tragic couple of years. But once again, Mary threw herself into her literary career. She worked for Lord Byron around this time, and it sort of fell to him as their closest friend to make sure that Mary was not taken care of, but that she was sort of going on her way and moving forward in life. And this is when Mary's existing friendships, which already weren't that numerous, they knew people, but they weren't very close with many people because they were so ostracized from common society. Her friendships were tested. People she thought she knew, people she thought she could count on, would just let her down time and time again. The first of those was actually Byron. It was up to Byron to sort of negotiate on Mary's behalf with her father-in-law, who was that rich landowner, Percy's father. He wanted to negotiate with him to financially support Mary and her surviving son, Percy Florence. Sir Timothy said absolutely not. He wanted nothing to do with Mary Shelley. He refused to financially support her or Percy, but he did offer to support Percy Florence if Mary would relinquish her guardianship of him, and Sir Timothy could find what he thought was a suitable guardian to finish raising him. Byron, as we know from his experience with his own daughter Allegra and how he was perfectly fine with separating from her mother and sending her to a convent, he encouraged Mary to do this and to just let Percy Florence go. Naturally, Mary was very much against this. She didn't have anyone else in the world, and Percy Florence, her son, was sort of the last tether to her past and to the man she loved. So she said no. Byron urged her to say yes, and so that was sort of like a tension in their friendship. And also it was tense just because the three of them were just that, a three of them. It was Byron, Percy, and Mary. And Mary felt like when Byron talked to her, they would ask questions, they would be going over his work together. It was like he would talk to her but be expecting Percy to answer. And it was just hard, I'm sure. Mary desperately needed money though. She needed to sort out her future, and so she decided, she had this idea to go back to England because she felt like if she was closer, she could convince Sir Timothy to financially support her and her son, because she thought that once he got to know his grandson, that he would just be more open to taking care of them. But Byron offered to pay her fare back, and then Mary said no. And the only reason she said no is because a poet they both knew, like a mutual friend, Leigh Hunt, sort of stirred up trouble between them. Leigh showed Mary some letters that Byron had sent to him. Like, it's just basically a gossip mill. And in these letters, Byron had been sort of less than courteous about his thoughts on the Shelleys, how they were as a couple, how maybe he didn't approve of every single thing he did. And Mary's so sensitive after all of this, and really she began idolizing Percy again, I think because she felt bad because they weren't getting along or their relationship wasn't as strong at his death. She was just supremely upset by this. She felt betrayed by Byron. And really, I feel like this is something Byron would never say. He was probably just venting to Leigh or whatever, and I don't think he really meant anything malintentioned by it, but Leigh Hunt, I guess, just wanted to stir up trouble. So Mary said no to him paying for their fare, even though she didn't have a way to get the money elsewhere. Byron actually still tried to take care of Mary's fare and like be a friend in this way. He tried to give the money to Hunt to give to Mary, but Leigh Hunt just pocketed the money for himself, and Mary had to get a loan from two other friends. So here she is thinking that this Leigh Hunt guy is doing her a favor, and really he's just screwing her over. And it would not be the first time that these people she knew from her youthful dalliances would really let her down and turn out not to be the upstanding friends she thought they were. To me, the culmination of all of this led to probably a restructuring in Mary's mind about what was appropriate in life, what the goals of life were. Like, I'm sure she was just going through a lot of spiritual and physical changes and just trying to make her new way in the world. And maybe she was realizing that the more radical thoughts she had as a kid didn't really lead to a happy, successful life. Back in England, her plan worked, and she did get Sir Timothy to give her a small allowance and Percy a small allowance, which she was able to send him to school with, which was one of her ultimate goals. She did make some money off of her writing, but it was never enough to live without Sir Timothy's subsidy. Regarding her writing, she really wanted to do a biography of Shelley or like a compilation of his work, and Sir Timothy kept saying no. He didn't want any more sullying of his family name. He just wanted her to drop it. Then he said only if you include like less controversial poems, and eventually Mary agreed to that as well. And I think she personally wanted that for herself for other reasons. I think she wanted to, maybe without realizing it, separate the Percy in reality who maybe wasn't that perfect of a person and turn a radical into a more virtuous visionary, which is really easy to do, especially when they're already passed away and you can sort of rewrite or reform your own history, cut out what's inconvenient, keep what looks good. And I think that's exactly what Mary did. By the time Percy's biography and collection was published, she had definitely only kept in the good stuff and sort of cut out the stuff that made her look bad. I think that Mary was trying to restructure her life. I think she realized that her reputation from her youthful dalliances was just cutting her off from society. It was making it really hard for her to move forward, to form relationships, and she was changing her mind about a lot of her own personal philosophies. For example, she rewrote Frankenstein, republished it, and she did it with a change or several changes in the story that led to more conservative views than the original version, which was more against society. This one was against society in some ways, but definitely more conservative and more approachable to the society of the time. It's clear she was trying to transition, but it seemed like no matter what she tried, how she tried to spin the story or resort history, something would always get in her way. It was really hard for her to meet new people, to form connections. She reread her mother's works and thought about getting remarried even. That would be a letdown to her. Just a lot was ruined because of what had happened in the past. Jane Williams, who was like a family friend of her and Percy, let her down in a friendship as well. This woman who she really idolized. I feel like she did that a lot. I feel like Mary was a person who loved hard or loved not at all. And when you were in her good graces, you were in great graces, but when she felt betrayed by you, that was it. And that was the case with Jane Williams. And Jane had been spreading rumors about how insufficient Mary was as a wife and just saying some kind of nasty things about her friend. And they had a falling out. I assume she felt really just lonely and wanted to be with someone again, wanted to have a second life maybe. To me, it seems like she was this wild kid. She did some wild stuff. She made a lot of life mistakes. And then at some point she realized, hey, maybe this isn't the way. And then she tried to backtrack. But that's not so easy in the mid to early 1800s. Even when she met new people, they would find out or they would know her name. She was only really allowed to talk to men because it was acceptable for men to talk to women like her, but it wasn't okay for their wives to, so she probably felt just really excluded and once again just displaced from everyone else. When she wanted to remarry, she had a few different suitors over the years. A couple of them would sort of get her hopes up, play around with her or whatever, and then they'd like choose a younger girl instead or just ghost her, just stop talking to her. There was one particular guy who was a member of parliament that she was really taken with and really wanted to be with, and it seemed like the family sacrificed some greater society for the sake of Mary, but at the end of the day, he chose a much more suitable wife, a much younger wife, and that really hurt Mary Shelley's feelings. I mean, she was full on expecting a proposal and it just never happened. And then 5 years later with the same guy, his original wife died and she once again got up hope that like he was going to propose and it was going to be her, and he once again chose someone younger and more socially acceptable. It was like she just could not escape this no matter how much she tried. Mary's literary endeavors were really the buoy in her life. Her writing was what got her through everything. It was her form of expression. It was how she was seen by the world, how she got her thoughts out there. So Mary Shelley really spent the rest of her life with her son, traveling a bit, writing a lot, and eventually she would complain of headaches, and it turned out that she actually had a slow-growing brain tumor, which eventually caused her to slip into a coma, and she died just a week later. Unfortunately, after the death of Mary Shelley, her work was largely ignored until a resurgence of interest in the 1980s. That concludes our 10 facts, and I know it was a lot of information, but if you'll allow me to be a bit Freudian for just a few more minutes, because I want to talk about just the epicness of this life and the lessons learned from it and just Mary Shelley in general. To me, it's really clear how her life had an impact on her work. I don't think that's true of every author, but for Mary Shelley, it definitely seems like all of her work was centered around this person who would become isolated, who would be looked down upon. I think that Mary was the monster in Frankenstein. To me, it seems a lesson learned too late. It seems like when Mary later in life became more conservative herself, she was changed, but it didn't make a difference. She could never outrun her past. I was actually quite proud of how Mary changed after the death of Percy. She really rethought about everything she believed, and she considered what her mother said about feminism and women's rights. And while she did change her mind and believed in marriage and really wanted to be someone's wife and to be a mother, she really believed in that, she also realized that the best way to help people and help women have that independence and education and freedom was not through talking the talk, but through walking the walk. And so she stopped talking and she started doing, and she would help women where she could in her own communities. I personally believe that that's the way to make change happen, is just by living your life how you think or hope that society will, and just hope that it follows from there. And it also meant that she made a real difference in real people's lives later on. Instead of just talking about the injustices, she did something about it. I'm gonna leave it there for the Mary Shelley bio. It's a lot of crazy information. It completely blew my mind. I just could not believe all of the stuff that happened and the scandal and the drama. And it was certainly entertaining. It was crazy, it was emotional, I felt sad, I felt angry a lot of the time, and I'd be really curious to hear what your insights on this are. Had you heard about Mary Shelley's backstory before this? Or is this just the first time you'd ever even heard any of this craziness? Let me know below. Let me know which part you thought was most shocking or stood out most to you. Thank you so much for watching and letting me do these nerdy author bio series. I have a lot of fun doing them, and I hope you have fun listening to them. If you liked this video, do me a favor and give it a big thumbs up before you head off. Drop me a comment below, and if you're new here and you haven't subscribed yet and you like all things bookish, book reviews, book hauls, stuff like this, just good nerdiness, then go ahead and press that subscribe button, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.